As you see on the stage, we are almost done. It looks like I have not counted. We have almost all of our. So if you do have any issues, let us know. We'll see what we can work out. Um, August 7th. August 7th. kind of thing. And so they'll give you all kind of from their perspective this morning. But I really loved it. It was really, really neat. So. Are we live streaming right now? We are? Let me save that for the end. Okay. Okay. I've got to figure out where my remote is. You've heard rumors of the bear? He just wanted to hear about Jesus, I think is what it was. That's right. Okay. Let's see. Maybe? Something. Nope. All right, while he's doing that, since we do have a beat, I will tell you quickly a story from youth camp. How many of you have heard about the bear at camp? Some of you? Okay, you're about to find out then. So it was Wednesday night. From my perspective, preaching and like visual perspective and then just personal perspective, Monday was kind of rough. Very few of the students knew me at all. I mean, they may have known about me, but no personal connection. My jokes were just not landing. It was a rough crowd, and I was trying to like figure out, do I push it? Do I really lean into it and try to be funny, or do I just preach what I've prepared and trust that God's at work? I went that route because it just wasn't happening, and so. But as the week went on, and the way Eli structures, I could talk all day about how great of a camp he organizes. The way he structures, everything's intentional. There's no kind of wasted opportunities, and so even the cooks, we have the opportunity to get to be around them and hang out with them and be with the kids, and it's really, really great. So as the week went on, I got to know the kids more, and they loosened up more, and so they were listening the whole time, but they were much more engaged by Wednesday night. And so Wednesday nights, time of worship, the day had gone really well. The time of worship before I preached was going really well. I was very encouraged, and I'm in the middle of my sermon on Wednesday, and like I do here, I had looked down at my notes to see where my next point was and kind of scan ahead to see where I was going so I could look back up and kind of engage more. And then when I did that, if you haven't seen the pictures or the videos of Have Camp, we're in a giant, massive cabin, and we just kind of changed the garage to be our worship space. And so I'm at the very back of the garage, looking out the garage into the wilderness, and all the students are in the garage, and the adults are on the very, very back row, kind of on the driveway. And so I look down, collect my thoughts, and as I'm preaching and I look up, and my brain is playing a trick on me because I could swear I see this huge bear there. And it was. This massive bear had come down from the woods and was much closer than I wish he would have been. And so I had a split-second opportunity to figure out what on earth I'm going to do because the day had gone really, really well. I know as soon as I say, oh my goodness, a bear, that like all the momentum we had built will be shot, but also there was nowhere for those kids to go except towards the bear. And so I don't want them to do that. And so they teach you in seminary and just life experience that if there's distractions, you just preach through it. And so I just keep preaching and just watch the bear, and he never looks up, never comes towards us. I was making in the back of my mind plans what to do if he charges, not trying to be hero, but to keep us safe kind of thing. And so I just have like laser eye focus just on the bear, and I keep preaching, and then he kind of gets out of my line of sight, so I preach, and then I look up, he's coming back through, but he never got any closer. He was already closer than I wanted him to be. No one else noticed but me this whole time, and I'm just watching him, and then he disappears back where he came from, and then just never came back. And so I said, okay, Lord, help us. You have helped us. Continue to help us. Keep him away. And so I don't remember most of that sermon, to be honest, but God knows what he was doing. And I finished the sermon. I closed in prayer, transitioned back to a couple more songs. The worship team came back up. And then once I finished that, I went back to the back where all the adults were, where the kids couldn't see me. And I whispered, there's a bear. Oh, my God. And we're all like scrambling and trying to figure out what to do and not let the kids know that we're all panicking. But it worked out okay. He never showed back up. It was fine. It ended up being a really fun story and something I hope to not experience again. So put that behind me. So that's the bear story, and now you know. Okay, that being said, does not look like this is working, so let's not sweat it. let's get back into our study. I'm going to give us some recap of where we've been. Some of you may have grabbed, I put a few handouts out in case the screens weren't working tonight, of our little timeline that we've been tracking through. I'm not going to track through all the major themes, but it has been 2 weeks since we were last in this series, because last week we were off, the week before we did our Hungary mission trip update. But we have finally gotten to Jesus, and we've been building towards him, and we said each step of history has been meaningful, has been intentional. God has been at work the whole time. We, from our perspective in history, are very privileged to see big picture what all God was doing leading up to Jesus, but it doesn't mean none of it mattered before him. It did. But what we covered last time we met was showing the connection that Jesus had with the Old Testament. That he didn't just appear out of nowhere, but that the Old Testament had been building. God had been at work. God had been pointing in this direction. And so when Jesus bursts on the scene, it's not a bursting on the scene. He shows up in a new way and shows God's work in a new way, but he didn't come out of nowhere. God had been pointing and foretelling, especially as we get into the prophets, that this figure, this Messiah, this messianic figure was going to come, and he was going to make things right. And so when he does show up, a lot of what we see in the New Testament is absolutely him preaching and teaching and doing miracles, which is good and very, very important. But also at the same time, there's this undercurrent of everyone just trying to figure out who he is. And the disciples are wrestling with it, and they have, firsthand knowledge and direct experience with his teachings and his miracles, but then just living life with him and the conversations they get to have and the questions they get to ask. And no one quite knows what to do with Jesus. Some people are very open to him and receptive. Others are varying degrees of skeptical or just unsure. Some are just confused. We see the disciples themselves just can't seem to pick up on what he's doing. And then Jesus had earned some pushback and some hostility from the powers that be for various different reasons. But what we talked about last time we met in particular, again, Jesus didn't come out of nowhere. He had been part of God's plan. He was God in the flesh, and he was showing up, and he's trying to clarify in different ways who he is and why he's come and what God's heart is for the people. And in particular, what really threw people off was he was not what they were expecting him to be or even what they wanted him to be. Jesus did not fill the role of leader, of king, of savior in the categories that they had prepared in their minds and their hearts for him. And so that did not dissuade Jesus, but he had his work set out for him to show people. And we know he did it in many different ways. And a lot of times it was subtle. And as he worked with people, as the Spirit of God worked as well in opening people's eyes of faith, then they started to see who he was. But again, even the disciples, we talked last time, even Peter, we had this moment when we were in Matthew's gospel where he has this epiphany, this theophany. God reveals, because Jesus asks, hey, who does everyone think I am? And they're throwing out all these different ideas. And Jesus says, well, who do you think I am? And Peter nails it, right? He says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. You're the one. And Jesus says, you're right, Peter. And you didn't come to this on your own, but the Spirit of God has opened your eyes. So, this is good. But in the very next moment, we see all of us, this is our story too, that we can see Jesus and make that connection, but at the same time still miss it, because Jesus starts talking about, not only is he the Son of God, he is the chosen one, he is the Messiah, the long-awaited one. All those things are true, but the way that he's going to be bringing about God's kingdom directly involves his suffering and his death. And Peter was not okay with that, if we remember, right? He said, never. I would never let you die. And Jesus rebukes him very, very, very strongly. And in my paraphrase is, you don't get it, Peter. But you have an opportunity to learn. And so you can come along and you can listen and you can trust me. But if you set yourself against me, even with the best of intentions, you're setting yourself against the ways of God and the kingdom of God. And that was disorienting for Peter, disorienting for us. But we're watching. And then in the very next scene, as we're tracking through Matthew in particular, Jesus has this It's this wonderful little series of events. So Peter has this beautiful moment where he recognizes Jesus as the Christ, and then he has this terrible moment where he still wants Jesus to be the Christ according to his standards and his terms, and Jesus clarifies it doesn't work that way. In the very next moment, according to Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, not just me suffering, those who belong to me and follow me, you need to take up your cross and die and follow me, and there find life. And the disciples, again, this is not what we had expected, and we're not quite sure what you mean by that. But then we push further, and where we ended last time was the transfiguration. And we read Matthew's version of it in Matthew 17. And Jesus takes his closest 3 disciples. They go up on the mountain, and Jesus is there. And do you remember who else showed up? Moses and Elijah. And we said, this is remarkable for a whole host of different reasons. 1, because these guys had long since been dead. But 2, if we can suspend our desire to figure out how it worked, how they got there, where they came from, where they were going, any of that, if we can let that go for a moment and just let the moment be what it was, we said, big picture, this is God clarifying that Jesus is exactly who he said he is, and that his followers need to trust him. It may not play out. It's not going to play out in ways that you fully understand or expect, but God is at work. Will you trust and follow Jesus? Again, there's so much more to it, but that we said was the gist. And Peter and the disciples that were there, James and John, they were struggling to wrap their minds and their hearts around it, but we said, this is God. And then God spoke, just like he had at the baptism of Jesus. He said, this is my beloved Son. And this time he gave us that helpful phrase, listen to him. What he's saying is not crazy. It's not what you expect, but it's on purpose and it's good. Follow him. And that's where we stopped. And so we're going to pick up from there, if I can find my spot in my notes. Because after this, Josh, you got it working. You got it halfway working. I got my clock back. Thank you, man. All right, we'll keep going. From this powerful mountaintop, literal mountaintop moment, Jesus, and according to Luke's gospel in chapter 9 and some other places, this phrase comes up that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. What does that mean? What do you think?
Preparing himself for crucifixion, what he's got to go through.
Yeah. So Jesus didn't get to the cross and was like surprised by it. No, again, Jesus knew and trusted. Josh, my man, thank you. Will you go like 2 slides to the right? It will let you? Yeah, one more? One more. Perfect. Thank you. You're the best, Josh. Thank you so much. Oh, I love it. Okay. So Jesus, so we're in between John the Baptist, the 12, and before the cross. So we're in that little small gap, part of the climax, if you will, as it's listed there. Jesus, after this moment, up until this moment, had known God's will, was following God's will, but he was laying groundwork for what was to come. And from this moment, it's all downhill. From this moment, he sets his face, he shows his intentionality. This is what's coming. As God the Father had foreordained it, had written it, Jesus knows, he had told his disciples, they didn't get it. He was still going there anyway. He had been preaching, he had been teaching, he had been healing, but all of that was just prelude to what he was going to do here. And as he starts making his way there towards Jerusalem, towards the cross ultimately, again, with the disciples largely clueless, trying to figure out what's going on and what it means for Jesus to bring about God's kingdom, Jesus' explanations and his teachings and his stories and parables about the kingdom aren't aggressive, but they get sharper and to the point. Let me give you some examples. This can be like a flurry of references here, but you'll get the idea. Jesus, as he's getting closer and closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem and his ultimate death and resurrection, he's explaining more and more what God's kingdom is like. And again, for our purposes, not what it's going to be like someday, but he says right here, right now, you can already see, I've come to bring God's kingdom. This is what God is about. This is what my kingdom is about. So let you know now, this is what we're starting. This is where this is going. And it's upside down. It's upside down from what people would expect or even what people would want of God's kingdom. And we're not just talking about those who oppose Jesus. They didn't like him. He made them uncomfortable. He threatened their power and their influence. So we understand why they weren't happy with him. But other people too, for example, those who were wealthy. Jesus did not hate or dislike those who were wealthy, but he taught in increasingly clear ways that wealth can be an incredible hindrance to seeing and believing and entering into God's kingdom. So the situation where he encounters what we call the rich young ruler, right? The rich young man who comes to Jesus. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus has this really beautiful back and forth with him, and the young man doesn't quite get it, because in the eyes of the world, surface level, he has everything. Not only is he a young man with all his life ahead of him, he's already very wealthy. And he's like, what more could I possibly need to do or have to get this eternal life business you're talking about, this God's kingdom stuff that I want? And Jesus tells him, you lack one thing, right? Go sell all your things, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And the young man's devastated because he can't, and he won't. He won't let go of those things. And so Jesus uses these kind of examples, and then there's the parable in Luke 19 of the rich man and Lazarus. They both die, and the rich man finds himself in torment in hell, while Lazarus, meanwhile, not Jesus' friend Lazarus, but Lazarus, finds himself in heaven, in the fullness of life. And Jesus uses this to turn people's opinions, again, upside down and inside out. The things that we think are meaningful and our advantages and our blessings in life are, but if you're not careful, you'll focus more on that and you'll miss out on what God is doing. And so in a way, those who are desperate for God, who are messed up and know it, those who need him, they're in a prime position to receive this abundant life and grace and mercy that God provides. So he's preaching these lessons, and it's confusing people and throwing them off. He talks about power with his own disciples because they're not understanding. They're asking him, so in the kingdom, who gets to be the greatest? Who gets to sit next to you? Can we give us give us the roster, Jesus, who's starting, if you will? And Jesus says, you still don't get it. But I'll talk to you about this. If you want to be the greatest, I'll tell you what you can do. Serve. Make yourself the lowest. Humble yourself the most. That's the way into true influence in God's kingdom. You want to be great, then you go serve. That's where greatness is. And they file that away as another funny thing that Jesus says. Don't fully understand it. But as we get closer and closer to the cross, and especially on the other side, looking back, they realize exactly what he was planning on doing. So he talks about real power looking like serving rather than dominating. The greatest in the kingdom are actually those who are least. He talks a lot about grace and forgiveness being truly foundational, and he's declaring and showing God's heart and how God wants us not to just come to him to receive forgiveness, but because of that be changed and then let that forgiveness flow out in how we love and serve one another. Again, we're turning things upside down. And then lastly, what we today call the triumphal entry. Jesus has shown up. It is the week, Passion Week. Death is coming at the weekend. And Jesus comes to town. I preached on this, I think last year at Easter, actually. And how did Jesus come into town? Riding on a donkey. And why did we say that was peculiar?
They expected a conquering hero.
Yeah. They wanted a military hero, a political hero. They wanted big, strong, bold display of power for God's glory. And Jesus, again, showed them, you're missing the point. And the king has come to town, and even more than that, God has returned, and he's bringing peace, and he's going to die to bring it about. And it's right there in front of them, and the gospel writers, for us, are giving all these clues to let the reader know that Jesus is more than anyone understood at the time, and so we get to see it. But it's really, really neat, because so he comes to town, he's riding on the donkey, and then as one of the gospel writers mentions, he sees Jerusalem before he gets there, and he weeps over it. He's heartbroken. Do you remember why? Because they just don't get it. And they're God's people, and they have God's laws, and they have the history, and they have the sacrifices. All these great themes, right, from the Old Testament that we've covered. They have all these advantages of God showing them who he is, and they've missed it. And it's breaking his heart, but he's coming to do something about it, right? And then he shows up on the donkey to show what kind of king he is, what he's bringing about. And it's not war in the sense that they want, but he's there to lay down his life for them. And then the Gospels say that he enters into the temple. And we said, as we've been tracking through this story, that is profoundly significant because the prophets in the Old Testament, as we got closer and closer to the end of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, they were getting more and more direct that God is coming back someday, and he's going to enter the temple, and he's going to make things right. So the gospel writers are picking up on this. Malachi 3 and 4, for example, said, one like Elijah is going to show up before him, the messenger preparing the way. Isaiah had called this out too. We recognize that was John the Baptist. And then God is coming on the heels of that. And Jesus came, that's God. And he didn't come just teaching, he came right into the mix of it all, and he entered the temple, just as God had promised he was going to do. And so Jesus is drawing all these things to a fulfillment. And we're not going to go through this. We do it each year at Easter week, if you remember. But we track through that last week of Jesus' life. And we said everything he's doing is intentional. He's still teaching and preaching, and he's showing and clarifying and explaining God's heart and what he is up to, but also there's an edge to it where he's not being soft with it because he knows exactly where he's going by the end of this week. But also, if you remember, that week was really important. And we're going to talk about this, and we got plenty of time, so I'm excited. There are three things. When Jesus shows up in Jerusalem, that last week of his life before his death, do you remember why he was in town on the surface level? Thank you. So they were celebrating Passover. And why is Passover significant? Yeah. And so where on our timeline does that fit, the original Passover? You remember? Yeah, the Exodus, right? Okay. So Jesus comes up, he shows up. Again, he's not just some outside figure that's come. He is truly one in the life of God's people, and he's redeeming their storyline that all of them in their own way, just like us, have messed up. He enters into it. And so he shows up in town, and things are already heated because there's more people than normal in the capital city, Jerusalem. The Romans are always nervous, we know historically at this point, because so many people are in town. The Romans are the empire that's in charge, but they know in a moment's notice something could spark a riot or a revolution. There have been some in the past that they've had to quell, and so the Romans are a little on edge and a little trigger happy, trying to make sure crowds don't get crazy. The Jews were hyped up, to use a modern phrase, for a lot of different reasons. But again, Passover was this major feast and festival each year. It was deep, it was meaningful, it was fun. I mean, so people are coming and things are intense. And so Jesus comes in, and in case there was any doubt that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing, we get to Matthew chapter 26. So let's look there. And we'll talk about this on Sunday. Well, this will come up on Sunday when we come to the Lord's table together. Matthew 26, verses 26 through 29. If someone's there, if you could read it for us. Okay, so Jesus is, and we know he was a master teacher. He would often use very common elements of life to draw connections to help people understand what God's kingdom was about, what Jesus was teaching, that sort of thing. So that's very common. And he takes common elements that would have been a natural part of the Jewish feast and participation in the Passover. But here, if the disciples would see it, he makes it explicit and direct. We aren't just celebrating what God has done. I'm letting you know God is up to something right here, right now, and it's me. So these things that we celebrate, and rightfully so, praising God for how he has freed us. And again, the themes that run really, really deep here with the original Passover and the blood of the lamb and the sacrifice and being protected by the blood being over you. Jesus is saying, Do you see it yet? I'm going to die, and my blood is going to cover you, and my blood is bringing about a new glorious fulfillment of God's work and God's kingdom. And as he said, as John mentions for us, Jesus had said elsewhere previously, there's no other way to God but through me. It's me. This has been God's plan from the beginning. And in this moment, he says, it's upon us. And so take and eat and understand, you don't understand, but you will, that what I'm doing here isn't just celebrating Passover, and it's not just fulfilling truly what Passover ultimately, big picture, was pointing to. He says there's a new covenant at work here. What was, in your own understanding or your own definition, how did we define or understand covenant in the Old Testament? Do you remember? It was related to that. There was some blood sacrifice involved. Do what? An agreement and contract between who and for what? So, in big picture, just in life, covenants were very common. It's like a business arrangement, a contract, an agreement, right? And it had stipulations. If we're going to enter into business together, one side was I'm going to do this, I'll uphold my end, and you'll uphold your end, and we'll be good to go. And so we said in a grander, deeper, more significant sense, God made a covenant starting with Abraham and those who follow, all these great promises to bless you. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to bless the whole world. I'm going to give you a land. It's going to be amazing. And we said, for our purposes, God's covenant didn't start with the promise, our third theme there on the left with Abraham. It started back at the very beginning with creation. What God set in motion, which humans messed up with sin and their rebellion, God never gave up on. And he's always continued to be faithful. And so for his covenant promises, he's just showing that continued faithfulness and told Abraham, there's nothing you've done to earn it or deserve it, but I'm doing these things to bless my people who will bless the world to my glory. And as time went on, there were ups and downs, and there was greater understanding, and not additions to the covenant, but developments of the covenant through Noah and through Moses, especially when God gave the law. And there's some stipulations here where God says, if you listen and follow my ways, it leads to life. If you reject my ways, it will not end well for you. But on my end, I will always be faithful. And we've seen that. He then displayed it throughout history. And then with David, do you remember the promises that God made to David in his line? Someone from your line will be on the throne of my kingdom. How long? Forever. All right, so these promises and this covenant gets bigger and deeper and deeper. And the problem was, repeatedly with this old covenant, the people they just couldn't do it. They could do it for a little bit, and then they'd get off. And then the next generation could do it for a little bit, and they'd get off, and they'd face judgment and discipline and hardship and all sorts of things. God continued to be faithful. Okay, so then Jesus shows up. Everyone in the room is fully aware of what Passover means, fully aware of what the Old Testament covenant was about, what it involved, and why it mattered. And Jesus, again, is saying, okay, all that is true, all of that is important, all of that has brought us here because God is faithful, and I'm telling you, this is going to be different. It's the things that the prophets had foretold, that on your own, you can't do it. On your own, you can't achieve the good things that God wants for you, so God has done something about it. And so if you trust me and you follow me, what's coming is starting a new covenant, as the prophets had foretold, as you had longed for, just as God had wanted from the beginning. So it's this new Passover, this new Exodus, this new and final covenant, God with his people to set things right. And it's going to bring about, you see the little third theme there, a revolution, but not in a way that they thought. Again, the people were looking for political revolution. They were looking for that tyrant of Rome to be off our back so God's people can be on top. King David, the monarchy, we're going to be on top again. But Jesus had been showing and telling, just as God had from the beginning, your sights are too low. You're looking just right here with what you know and understand. You're often looking to the side to see what everyone else in the world is doing, and that never works well for you. If you would just lift your eyes up, and if you would trust me as your king, and trust the plans I have for you, trust my faithfulness, it's bigger and deeper and wider than you can ever imagine. And Jesus then now stands there and is going to be the final, most definitive declaration of God's heart for his people. They needed deliverance. They needed a revolution, but not from Rome. And it wasn't ultimately about Babylon or Assyria or the Philistines or anyone before that. The biggest issue, and we'll talk more about this in the next week, the biggest tyrant that was overwhelming and crushing the people was what? Their sin and their death and Satan and his ways of distracting and destroying that which is good, right? And so God has come to do something about it, and the people didn't quite see it yet. So Jesus does, and he tells them, this is what this means, and this is what's about to happen. And even as he goes to his death, they still don't quite get it. Because what happens? What does Peter do? Mr. Defiant, I will protect you. I will lay down my life for you, Lord. I'm sword fighting in the garden, Lord. And then the very next moment we turn around and he's hiding and embarrassed and denying Jesus. And the other disciples just scatter, right? When Jesus needs them most. But Jesus dies. And in that moment, everything seems just awful. So maybe we didn't get it. Maybe Jesus just wasn't the guy we thought he was, because it looked like he was trending well. He was saying really great things. We were really buying in. We felt moved by the Spirit. We were seeing signs and wonders, evidence of God's kingdom here, not coming, but here. But now he's in the grave, and we're all in hiding, and nothing makes sense. Rome is still in charge. Sin and death, it seems, is still crushing the people, because our last best hope is in the grave. But we know he didn't stay in the grave, right? He rises again. And we know he met with the disciples. He kept kind of popping in and out, and we can talk about that some other day. I got some theories on what that means. But for our purposes, that's not important tonight. But what is really important, and we'll talk about this again in the weeks to come, when Jesus shows back up, when he dies and refuses to stay dead, and God raises him from the grave victorious, he shows up to the disciples, and he has different conversations, but let's go to Acts chapter 1. This is what we'll end on tonight. Well, if I can get there. Acts chapter 1. If someone could read for us. Oh, let's just do 6 through 11. If someone could read that out loud for us. Acts 1, 6 through 11. Okay. This is one of my favorite passages, and I can talk all day about this, but I want to narrow it down for tonight just to a few main things. So Jesus shows back up. The disciples, understandably, are overwhelmed. They're excited. He is the king. We have no idea what it means, but we know it's him, and he's here, and so all the things we'd hoped for are coming true. He was the one, all of it, everything. This is such a beautiful, uplifting, powerful moment, and they ask him, So is this it? This is it, right? I mean, you died. You didn't stay dead. You told us we didn't get it. We get it now. So do we win? And how does Jesus respond? Don't worry about those things. Let God take care of that. I've got work for you. And what does he tell them to do? Be my witnesses. And where? Here and there and everywhere is my really lazy paraphrase. But right, these circles, these ever-widening circles of context, starting in your own backyard and expanding to cover the entire world. And who's going to help them do it? The Spirit of God. Okay. So again, we're seeing, and this is so directly relevant to our lives, it is okay to love Jesus and be excited about Jesus and ask him about plans for his church for us today, for his kingdom, as they're asking back then. That's fine. That's what we know and understand. And they're not in trouble here. They're coming to him. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. Bring their thoughts, and they're all and lay it at his feet because he is the king. And so they're asking him, understandably, so is this now the time that we win? And he says, let me correct your vision here, as he'd done all throughout his ministry. Set these things aside. These things are important, but it's not for you to know. It's not for you to worry about. Trust that God knows what he's doing, and in the meantime, go be faithful. Trust me, and go be my witnesses. Go tell everyone what you've seen, heard. And it's not going to be about you doing it, just like it wasn't you earning it on the front end. The whole storyline has been a repetition of this. If you will trust me, you don't have to understand everything. God will give us enough, and it's good to seek understanding, absolutely. But at the core is, will you trust me, and will you follow me? Will you obey? I'll give you enough. I'll give you more than enough to get you moving in the right direction, and I will provide, and I will lead, and I will guide, and the more you lean on me, the more of me I'll give. It's just, God is just a bottomless pit of love and provision and power, all the things that his people need, all his promises that he said. And so the disciples then hear the word of Jesus say, don't worry about that. What I want you to worry about is just go and tell everyone everything you've seen and heard about me. And we know from that moment, then Jesus kind of, as best they can understand in our human minds, just kind of like rides off into glory. And they're just kind of dumbfounded again, still. And the angels say, hey, didn't he tell you to go do something? And like, oh, yes, let's go. And we know, from that moment, they were never the same. As you read through Acts and as you read through the rest of the New Testament, Peter especially, who was such a coward and a big mouth in so many ways, becomes like this dynamic, strong leader for the early church in so many different ways. And so they saw what God had been trying to say from the beginning. If you'll trust me and not worry about things that aren't for you to worry about, you can ask me questions, but if you'll trust what I tell you and you'll be faithful to me, watch what I'll do. Watch what I'll do. And they get to see it. And then the same call is for us as well. So what we're going to start covering the next several weeks moving forward is what the disciples then get to walk in deeper and deeper and deeper, and especially the ones who write in the New Testament wrote down for us to understand. Again, Jesus wasn't a flyby kind of guy who just showed up, did some cool stuff, and then vanished. God had been building to this moment. Jesus didn't come out of nowhere. He has this connection to all of God's work. And then even when Jesus physically wasn't on earth, it's not like he had just vanished and left them on their own. They had the power of the Spirit. But the disciples, finally looking back, get to see the fullness and the fulfillment of just who Jesus was all along. And that's what we're going to track the next several weeks. We'll look back kind of theme by theme how Jesus was the true fulfillment of what God was doing, leading there. Okay. That was a lot. Do we have any thoughts or questions on any of that tonight? All right, well, I hope you come next week. Next week we'll look more specifically, I think, on the topic of Jesus as King and what it means for him to be King. All right, well, let's transition to our prayer lists.